the environmental think tank community really started emphasizing carbon pricing as a policy idea because it was meant to appeal to a more conservative philosophy, right? So if we go back to that time, it was something meant to appeal to a conservative government.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and director of policy at the Broadband Institute. The price of carbon is in the news again, with conservatives in Canada and around the world where carbon pricing schemes exist are fueling backlash against the climate action policy amidst the profit-induced inflation and affordability crisis. For the centrist regimes that pushed for this market-based approach as their main climate policy plank, they've been on the back foot. In Europe, for instance, Green and Liberal parties have suffered major setbacks in the recent waves of EU, national, and subnational elections where a so-called Greenlash against carbon pricing policies were blamed for contributing to these electoral defeats. In Canada, recent headlines have sparked debate and confusion as to what climate action policy ought to be. Retrenchment of Canada's carbon pricing system, implemented by the Trudeau Liberal government through its 2017 Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, has been put on the table, sparking worry for some climate action groups. And on the other hand, justification for this approach has been that the burden on the working class has been too much, and that the real culprits for carbon emissions, the industries and corporate profiteers, ought to instead be paying their fair share for climate action. As carbon pricing has been the lone climate action policy from the federal government over the last 7 years, Canadians have been expressing their frustrations against the scheme. I think we need to cut through some of this confusion, and so joining me on the show today is Brendan Haley, climate expert, Broadband Institute policy fellow, and editorial committee member of the Perspectives Journal, to talk about whether the market-based approach to climate action is actually working. Brendan, thanks for coming on to speak on the Perspectives Journal podcast.
My pleasure to be here.
Carbon pricing has been debated for what feels like decades, going back to the Stephen Harper era and becoming a plank of the Trudeau government's climate agenda. But as you pointed out in a Broadband Institute paper back in 2015, Canada should look beyond market-based climate strategies to resolve climate federalist challenges. How does your argument from almost a decade ago still relate to today's ongoing saga around carbon pricing?
Your mention of the Stephen Harper era there is perhaps the best way to start this conversation because, the environmental think tank community really started emphasizing carbon pricing as a policy idea because it was meant to appeal to a more conservative philosophy, right? So if we go back to that time, it was something meant to appeal to a conservative government. Right. And of course, it was mostly rejected by the Conservative Party, but it was actually then picked up by left of center parties. And, you might not be surprised that the Liberal Party likes the idea because it's consistent with a more market liberal approach. Right. And that type of thinking makes them want to put the carbon price as widely and universally as possible because you want to send this consistent market signal. But carbon pricing is not obviously a social democratic approach because it is a policy that says, really, let's send a signal through markets and then people are on their own and markets will figure it out, right? And social democrats don't typically take a position that markets always and automatically arrive at the best solution. That's why it's important to remove a lot of essential services from markets to deliver on, basic needs. And for economic policy to actively monitor and direct markets towards desired outcomes instead of, just sending pricing signals. If we go back again in history, that paper I wrote back in 2015 was at the very beginning of the Trudeau government. And it was a plea for them to lead with a climate policy based on regionally specific low carbon industrial strategies as a better way to deal with climate federalist politics at the time. Now, they didn't do that. The Trudeau government spent the bulk of their efforts in the first term implementing carbon pricing, right? Which meant they weren't implementing these more targeted policy approaches that would have perhaps more clearly defined what we're trying to accomplish, right, in more tangible ways, and then built stronger political coalitions in support of that approach. And so now when I think about what effect is that carbon tax having on the government today, I think it's having two effects. First is the government is backing away from other regulatory approaches because they have essentially expended all their political capital on the carbon tax. And they're really afraid of doing other things. And a great example of this is a green building strategy that was quietly released over the summer. And so that strategy was supposed to provide a regulatory framework for phasing out fossil fuel heating, supporting a massive retrofit of our buildings. But, the strategy didn't meet any of those benchmarks. We now are in a situation where we're going to be constructing buildings that heat with fossil fuels that are going to last for 50 to 100 years. When someone gets a new heating system or they buy a new air conditioner, there's no guarantee that it's going to be the most energy efficient, which means those customers aren't going to be protected from volatile energy prices. And instead of increasing public investments, the government canceled a greener home grant program that, and then didn't have an immediate replacement available that would have helped, in particular, middle class people retrofit their homes. Another example is on the electricity regulation side. There's a lot of discussion now about allowing, natural gas plants to be part of a so-called net zero generation mix. There's a framework for environmentally sustainable investments right now that has been delayed, again, about debates and concerns about if natural gas should be counted as an environmentally friendly fuel or not. That's one impact. The other impact is that the carbon tax really acts as a barrier to a lot of public investments because the market-based ideology behind the tax is that a lot of public investments aren't needed because the tax should, drive emission reductions through that higher price. So we're sitting here after almost 10 years of liberal governments without really evidence of what could have been delivered through those public investments early on, right? Like energy retrofits or public transportation, right? Those investment strategies were triggered by this government, actually, to some extent, but triggered fairly late. And they always have to kind of act as fill-ins to the carbon tax instead of really driving climate policy. So the history is important here. The carbon price was really meant to be a right of center climate policy. It wasn't meant to be a social democratic one. And in a lot of ways, the kind of obsession we have with carbon pricing right now is weakening climate policies in a bunch of other areas, definitely because of its political impact, but also the ideological impact that carbon pricing has in that it's often viewed as a substitute for a whole bunch of other climate policies that might actually make more sense to people or help people in their pocketbooks.
Oh, and speaking of affordability and people in their pocketbooks, according to polling done just last year by Leger, 7 in 10 Canadians are obviously worried about climate change, especially, with the recent climate disaster out of Jasper, Alberta. Canadians are experiencing the ever-present threat of climate change more and more than ever. But polling, also done by Angus Reid earlier this year, shows that most Canadians would rather reduce or eliminate carbon pricing. More than 2/3 don't think it has been effective in reducing Canada's emissions. And so even thinking about the affordability that you touched on earlier, why do you think there's this inconsistency between carbon pricing, support for this policy, and worries about climate change?
I'm going to be careful about interpreting different polling results, but I think maybe the hopeful message you can take from that is that Canadians believe climate change is real and they think it's a problem. And, that has to still be an opportunity for leadership and creative policy solutions, but solutions perhaps that speak to people's more multi-dimensional concerns. I think a challenge with the carbon tax is that it really fetishizes a certain policy instrument over outcomes. And, that is completely consistent with a real, if you want to just take a purist market-based policy ideology, right? The kind of neoclassical economist objective behind a carbon tax is not to save the planet or to do what is right from the ecosystem perspective. It is to get the prices right. So the market sends the right signals and the market decides if we are going to live on a habitable planet or not. Of course, in the real world of policy discussions, carbon tax advocates often have an environmental outcome in mind, and they will then argue that the carbon tax is the best instrument because it will deliver emission reductions at the lowest cost. But that's only the case if you view the economy as like an optimizing computer. If you view the economy acting more like an ecosystem where the actions you take today create entirely different pathways because they trigger different types of learning, they trigger industrial couplings, economic structures change in an evolutionary way, well, then the carbon price isn't necessarily the best or even lowest cost. And it actually might be quite incapable of triggering the structural shifts that we need towards a new economic trajectory, unless, of course, it's like enormously high. So, a different view of the economy can lead policymakers towards seeing public investments and sector-specific industrial strategies as actually the lowest cost option from a more dynamic efficiency perspective, because these policies are better able to monitor and steer in desired directions. So if you care about outcomes and you recognize that those outcomes can be, actively shaped by public policy, not just by sending a price signal, well, the litmus test for climate policy wouldn't be if you support a carbon tax or not, right? Instead, governments and those who hope to be in government should keep an eye on things like, how many heat pumps are being installed? How many people are getting their homes weatherized? How many electric vehicles are being sold? Are there affordable electric vehicles available on the market? Is public transit service available? What are the ridership numbers of public transit? How many large industries are electrifying or using more sophisticated, off-peak energy storage? How much public and private finance is being mobilized towards decarbonization, right? Those are like indicators that help you understand the evolution of the economy over time, instead of kind of just obsessing over a carbon policy instrument. And, to go back to the polling and apparent contradiction, well, those indicators might ultimately make more sense to people. And it makes more sense, I think, even from a policy perspective that has like a real world view of how economies change and evolve, and they don't operate like, computers.
So turning our attention to other places experiencing the same kind of debate, in a piece for the Hill Times published earlier this summer, Press Progress's Luc Lebrun observed a Greenlash in the EU elections held earlier this year that saw Liberal and Green parties take significant losses to center-right and far-right parties. Luke writes, "If Canada doesn't put workers first in its green transition, we could be next." In your view, are we experiencing a Greenlash given that contradiction in the polling? And what should progressives be proposing to fight back against this anti-climate policy sentiment?
Yeah, I think we're looking at, and maybe we're experiencing a protective reaction, that results from climate policy failing to truly integrate the need for social and economic security. And that failure of climate policy is being exploited by right-wing movements and political parties. So, the economic sociologist Karl Polanyi, he talked about how people threatened by the uncertainties and dehumanizing tendencies of markets will protect themselves, right? And the challenge for the left is to channel that need for that protection towards social solidarity, greater freedom. The counter tendency is to reject both markets and democracy, and perhaps we can add environment to that list as well. And I guess as someone who's worked in climate policy for a while, the issue, I think, is that we've tended to see social and economic security as like a nice to have, but ultimately something outside of the relevant boundaries of discussion. And I would say that that's not the case. And actually finding new ways of providing economic security that match up well with a low carbon economy is what we need to do right now to see the energy transition really take off, scale up, and reach its next stage of development. And, I can explain this with reference to major technological transitions we've seen in the past, right? When we've moved from kind of technology niches to like widespread use and production. Often, for that to happen, you need to define a new way of guaranteeing basic human needs. And the most celebrated example of this is really the 20th century social democratic institutions, right? So the 20th century experienced significant prosperity by unleashing the transformative potential of standardized, mechanized production. And that coincided with high rates of unionization, good wages, affordable mortgages, unemployment insurance, and other social safety nets. And that wasn't an accident, right? There was a social bargain essentially with workers because workers were going to lose some power and security that they had in craft production processes. And that was going to change. And the change was you can have equal or better amounts of power and security through, unionization and social safety nets. So that was a new way to guarantee social security that was a better fit with a new technological system, like moving to mass production. And so the lesson for me is that for climate policy to work, we need to define how will we guarantee social and economic security, but in new ways that are, complementary to low carbon technologies. And where actually the low carbon technologies themselves are a way better way to enhance those social guarantees, right? And so to give you a couple examples, you can walk through the list of kind of basic human needs here, right? So if we are going to have significantly improved energy efficiency performance through things like heat pumps, it will be the energy savings that matter much more than anything else. So it actually makes a lot more sense for customers to be paying a fixed fee to an energy solution provider, it could be public or private, to meet, their heating, lighting, service needs, right? And therefore having a fairly low and stable energy bill and not having to worry about the fluctuations of carbon taxes or energy market instabilities. Another example is that there's a big debate now about if electricity systems are going to need new gas plants to fire up at certain periods of like peak demand. Well, the alternative to that is to pay people. It's to pay people to heat their hot water tanks overnight, to charge their electric cars when the wind is blowing, to put a bunch of batteries in people's homes and community centers so that maintains that grid reliability while also protecting those buildings when the power goes out. The lower carbon, greener solution to natural gas plants in our electricity systems is to pay people to adopt digital and clean energy technologies so that they can shift their energy use, right? So that's a affordability enhancing, democratizing solution that really puts the customers first and is only made possible because of low carbon technologies. When we talk about careers and jobs, well, I think we got to move beyond kind of vague talk of just transitions towards, what we call active labor market policies. And what does that mean? Well, that means that at the ready is training, active job search, active job placement, focused more on people's careers and building them up than as a kind of defensive reaction in case you might lose your job. Part of that could also be a job guarantee for everyone. If the private sector isn't providing enough jobs at reasonable wages, the public sector will provide those jobs. And a lot of that work can improve local environments. So there's tons of opportunities here. And climate policy is really at a stage where we need to move from small niches to mass expansion. And the way to do that is I think we really need to define a host of economic security enhancing, almost social programs that accelerate the deployment of green technologies. And until we define a new social contract like that, we'll probably see Greenlashes. But if we can define that social contract about how economic security is integrated with the type of economic transitions we need, we might see a repeat of and then learn from the 20th century golden age.
Lastly, it's clear that the climate policy debate needs to correct that disconnect between real emissions reductions, affordability, jobs, and the need for economic transformation. But what should a real social democratic climate platform look like then, if it's not supposed to depend on market mechanisms?
First off, a credible plan to achieve net zero emissions has to have mandatory requirements. And those requirements are on those who have the greatest control over pollution, which are like the large industries, the utilities, landlords, and banks. So today we have some of those. We've got zero emission vehicle mandates. We have an industrial carbon pricing system. The latter in particular, could be strengthened. But additional requirements could be when products are sold, they're sold at a very high standard for energy efficiency, making sure every new building constructed, isn't exclusively heated with fossil fuels, right? And is very energy efficient, requiring owners and landlords of large buildings to improve their energy performance towards a net zero standard over time. We need to move away from voluntary environmental social governance towards mandatory regulations of banks. banks, right, to provide oversight to ensure financing policies are climate aligned and taking into account the risks of high carbon finance strategies. One idea I like is that banks issuing mortgages could be required to decarbonize their mortgage portfolios over time by providing affordable finance project management assistance to their clients, right? So all of these are examples of more sector-specific regulatory requirements that have clear net zero end states associated with them. And I don't think anyone's going to say, hey, implementing those are going to be, politically easy, like a piece of cake. But explaining something like, hey, new buildings are going to last for 50 to 100 years. They should be constructed to be highly efficient, not dependent on fossil fuels, because that's consistent with our climate goals. I think that makes a lot more sense to people than a carbon tax. And from a policy strategy perspective, these more sector-specific regulations enable governance to actually monitor progress, undertake therefore more strategic like barrier busting and encourage performance competition amongst those sector actors. So that's, I think, the first part. But the second and really important component is committing to making climate action work for people through large-scale, long-term public investments that help people. And those public investment strategies could be linked to a series of, say, missions that are inspiring and mobilizing for society. So we could have a mission to decarbonize all the buildings by making sure everyone who can immediately benefit from a heat pump or an energy retrofit will get one. Achieving a truly zero-emission electricity system by prioritizing paying people capable of shifting their energy demands first before we pay, power plant owners. Having clean transportation, making sure everyone can get to work through public transit or through an affordable electric vehicle, or perhaps through working from home. And so each of those missions would exist alongside sector-specific organizations that are monitoring those missions, steering markets towards achieving those missions, instead of just saying, well, we have a carbon tax that will make things work. And each of those missions could define the type of social contracts about how people should expect to have social and economic security in the future. I think, again, that type of approach to climate policy, it's just not a different way of doing it other than putting a carbon tax front and center. It really is, I think, what we need right now if we're going to move from just having niche markets for low carbon solutions towards expanding those low carbon solutions to everyone and widely across the economy, right? And so there's no better time for a policy approach like that. And we know with the carbon tax, the higher it goes, the less secure people can feel. Instead, we need climate solutions where the more we deploy them, the more secure people feel. And that's the type of policy approach we should be thinking about.
Brendan Haley, thank you for taking the time to chat with the Perspectives Journal podcast.
My pleasure.
That was Broadbent Institute Policy Fellow and Perspectives Editorial Committee member Brendan Haley. And if you like this interview, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy, on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.